I was holding a small velvet box when my phone started vibrating like it was about to break. I frowned and muttered, "What now?" The first message read, "Congrats, bro." I smiled without thinking and replied, "For what?" Before the reply came, another notification popped up. Didn't know she was getting married so soon. My smile froze. I whispered, "Married?" Then the call started. My cousin said, "Why didn't you invite us?" I laughed nervously and said, "Invite you to what?" He paused and replied, "Your girlfriend's wedding, man." My hand went cold. I said, "That's not funny." He sent a link. I opened it. I stopped breathing. On my screen was Ariba, dressed in deep red, smiling the smile she used only for cameras. Beside her stood a man I had never seen. The caption said, "Finally tied the knot." I said out loud, "No." My knees hit the bed. I scrolled. More pictures. Different angles. Different poses. Same lie. I whispered, "This isn't real." My phone rang again. This time it was my coworker. He said, "Man, are you okay?" I asked, "Okay about what?" He replied, "After what she did to you." I swallowed and said, "She didn't do anything." There was silence. Then he said, "Bro, it's everywhere." I ended the call. I stared at the screen until my eyes burned. My chest felt tight. I kept telling myself, "This is fake." But it looked real. Too real. I grabbed my keys and left my apartment. I drove without knowing where I was going. I called Ariba. Rang. It rang again. She didn't answer. I slammed the steering wheel and shouted, "Pick up." Finally she did. She said softly, "Hello?" I asked, "When were you going to tell me I was replaced?" She gasped and said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "Don't do this. I've seen the pictures." She went quiet. I said, "Say something." She whispered, "They're fake." I laughed, but it came out broken. I said, "Fake weddings don't trend." She said quickly, "Horace did it." I asked, "Did what?" She replied, "The pictures. He edited them." I said, "Edited an entire wedding?" She said, "It was supposed to be a joke." I shouted, "A joke?" People in the next car stared at me. She said, "Please lower your voice." I said, "My life is on fire and you want silence?" She cried, "I didn't know it would go this far." I asked, "Then why didn't you stop it?" She said, "I panicked." I said, "You panicked so you let everyone believe I was nothing?" She said, "That's not fair." I laughed again. I said, "Nothing about this is fair." I parked on the side of the road. My hands were shaking. I said, "Do you know what people are saying?" She whispered, "I don't want to know." I said, "They're laughing." She said, "I'm sorry." I asked, "Sorry enough to tell the truth?" She didn't answer. That silence hurt more than the pictures. I said, "Answer me." She said, "I need time." I said, "Time for what?" She replied, "To fix it." I said, "By staying quiet?" She said, "Please trust me." I closed my eyes. I remembered the ring in my pocket. I said, "I trusted you." She started crying harder. She said, "I never meant to hurt you." I said, "But you did." She said, "Horace crossed the line." I asked, "Where is he now?" She said, "I told him to take them down." I said, "And did he?" She whispered, "Not yet." I laughed, empty this time. I said, "So my name is a joke online." She said, "I'll talk to him again." I said, "Talk?" She said, "Please?" I said, "People are congratulating you on marrying someone else." She cried, "I know." I said, "Do you know what that feels like?" She said, "I can imagine." I snapped, "No, you can't." I ended the call. I sat there staring at the road. A message popped up from an unknown number. It said, "Sorry if this got messy." I replied, "Who is this?" 3 dots appeared. Then he wrote, "Horace." My jaw tightened. I typed, "You ruined my life." He replied, "Relax. It's just content." I felt something break inside me. I wrote, "Take it down now." He said, "It's already viral." I said, "You lied." He replied, "People believe what looks good." I said, "You crossed a line." He sent a laughing emoji. I stared at it for a long time. I typed, "You did this on purpose." He replied, "She wanted attention." I froze. I asked, "What did you say?" He wrote, "Ask her." I threw my phone onto the passenger seat. I whispered, "So that's it." My phone buzzed again. This time it was my mother. She said, Beta, is everything okay? I said, who told you? She replied, your aunt sent pictures. I closed my eyes. I said, they're fake. She said, then why is she smiling? I had no answer. She said gently, come home. I said, I can't. She said, people are talking. I replied, I know. I ended the call and rested my head on the steering wheel. I felt small. I felt stupid. I felt exposed. I thought about every time I defended Ariba. I thought about every excuse I made for her. I whispered, I was blind. My phone kept buzzing. Congratulations. Laughing emojis. Questions. No one asked me if I was okay. I opened social media again. The comments were worse. She upgraded. He wasn't good enough. At least she chose right. I felt sick. I drove back home. I sat on my bed. The velvet box was still there. I opened it. The ring caught the light. I said softly, you were never meant for this. I put the box in a drawer. I lay back and stared at the ceiling. I said out loud, she let this happen. That was the moment I understood. The betrayal wasn't the pictures. It was her silence. It was how easily she let the world erase me. That night Uzair called me. He said, tell me it's fake. I said, it is, but it doesn't matter. He asked, why doesn't it matter? I said, because people believe it. He said, what did she say? I replied, she blamed her assistant. He snorted, and you believe that? I stayed quiet. He sighed and said, listen to me. I said, I'm listening. He said, if she wanted to protect you, she would have posted the truth already. I whispered, I know. He said, then why are you still defending her? I asked, what else am I supposed to do? He said, protect yourself. I laughed bitterly. I said, from what? He replied, from disappearing. After the call, I checked my office group chat. Someone had posted the pictures there too. A message followed. Awkward. Another said, didn't see that coming. I typed nothing. I turned my phone face down. I stared at the wall. I remembered Ariba saying, trust me. I whispered, trust shouldn't feel like this. My doorbell rang. I ignored it. It rang again. I opened the door and saw Uzair standing there. He said, you look like Hal. I said, I feel worse. He walked in and said, sit. I sat. He asked, did you eat? I shook my head. He said, figures. He looked at the ring box on the table. He didn't ask. He just said, I'm sorry. I said, she chose herself. He nodded. He said, that's the truth. My phone buzzed again. It was Ariba. Uzair raised his eyebrows. I answered. She said, why aren't you replying? I said, what do you want me to say? She said, that you believe me. I asked, do you believe me? She paused. I said, exactly. She whispered, you're being unfair. I said, unfair is letting me drown while you stay dry. She cried, I'm scared. I said, so am I. She said, Horace promised to fix it. Uzair mouthed, lie. I said, promises don't erase damage. She said, please don't leave. I said, you already did. I hung up. Uzair said quietly, you did the right thing. I didn't answer. I wasn't sure yet. I lay awake all night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the pictures. In the morning, I checked again. They were still there. I realized something then. This wasn't an accident. This was a choice. And it had killed my name. I went to work anyway. As soon as I entered, conversations stopped. Someone whispered my name. I sat at my desk. Samir walked over and said, you okay? I said, do I look okay? He cleared his throat and said, if you need time. I said, I need respect. He nodded and walked away. At lunch, no one sat with me. My phone buzzed again. Horace wrote, no hard feelings. I typed, you humiliated me. He replied, fame has a price. I said, you'll pay it. He sent a thumbs up. I put the phone away. I looked around the office. I realized how alone I was. I whispered to myself, not forever. That thought scared me. It also steadied me. For the first time since the pictures, I felt anger instead of shame. I felt awake. I told myself, this is the breaking point. And I didn't know it yet, but everything after this would change. When I got home, I opened my laptop. I searched my name. The results hurt. Articles, posts, memes. I closed the browser. I said out loud, I didn't deserve this. No one answered. I checked my messages again. There was one from Ariba. I never said you didn't matter. I typed, you didn't have to. She replied, what does that mean? I said, silence speaks. She didn't reply. I lay on the floor and stared at the ceiling. I remembered the day we met. She had said, I hate lies. I laughed softly at the memory. I whispered, so do I. That night I made a decision. I wouldn't beg. I wouldn't explain. I wouldn't chase. If the truth came out, it would stand on its own. If it didn't, I would still survive. I closed my eyes and said, this is where I stop breaking. My phone buzzed one last time. It was a notification, not a message. The fake wedding had crossed 1 million views. I turned the phone off. I stood up. I looked in the mirror. My eyes looked tired but clear. I said, you're still here. For the first time that day I believed it. I didn't know how this would end. I only knew how it started. With pictures. With silence. With betrayal. And with my name being buried alive. I picked up the velvet box again. I weighed it in my hand. I said, not yet. I placed it back in the drawer and locked it. I sat on the bed and breathed slowly. Outside the city moved on. Inside I stayed still. I told myself, this pain will teach you. I didn't know what it would teach me. I only knew I would learn. Because losing everything leaves no room for lies. I turned off the lights. I lay down. In the dark I whispered, I mattered. No one corrected me. That was enough for now. Tomorrow would be worse. Or better. Either way I would face it. I closed my eyes. The pictures still waited online. But so did I. And I wasn't done yet. This was only the beginning. I didn't know the cost yet. I only knew the truth had teeth. And sooner or later it would bite back. I inhaled slowly. I exhaled. I prepared myself. Because my silence tonight was not surrender. It was patience. And patience, I was about to learn, can be far more dangerous than anger. This was the night my old life ended forever. Quietly. I woke up expecting my phone to be quiet. It wasn't. I said, not again, and checked it anyway. More messages. More screenshots. More people pretending they cared. I whispered, she'll fix this today. I believed that for almost an hour. I called Ariba. It rang. It rang again. She didn't answer. I texted, you need to say something. No reply. I waited. I stared at the screen like it might feel guilty. It didn't. Uzair called me instead. He said, you alive? I said, barely. He replied, she posted yet? I asked, posted what? He said, the truth. I laughed and said, no. He went quiet. Then he said, that's bad. I asked, how bad? He replied, people are deciding the story without you. I said, she won't let that happen. Uzair said, you sure? I didn't answer. I got ready for work. I looked at myself in the mirror and said, hold it together. My voice sounded fake. I left my apartment and walked to my car. A neighbor nodded at me. I wondered what he knew. I wondered what everyone knew. At the office the air felt heavy. People stopped talking when I passed. Someone pretended to check their phone. I sat at my desk and opened my computer. An email popped up. It wasn't about work. It said, hope you're okay, man. I closed it. Samir walked by. He looked at me. Then he looked away. I stood up and said, do you have a minute? He hesitated and said, later. I asked, why later? He said, just later. That was enough to tell me everything. Uzair messaged me, lunch? I replied, sure. I needed a friend. I needed someone who wasn't whispering. At lunch, Uzair didn't waste time. He said, people think she dumped you. I said, for who? He replied, for her husband. I clenched my jaw. I asked, and she's letting them think that? He said, she hasn't denied it. I stared at my food. I said, she said she panicked. Uzair snorted. He said, panicked people still talk. I said, she's scared. He leaned forward and said, scared of what? I whispered, losing her image. Uzair nodded slowly. He said, there it is. My phone buzzed. It was Ariba. I answered immediately. I said, finally. She whispered, can you not sound angry? I laughed. I said, I'm past angry. She said, I needed time. I asked, time for what? She said, to think. I replied, people are thinking for you. She sighed and said, you don't understand. I said, explain it to me. She lowered her voice and said, If I deny it now, I'll look cheap. The world went quiet. I asked, what? She repeated, I'll look desperate. I felt my chest tighten. I said, so I look disposable instead? She said, that's not what I meant. I replied, it's exactly what you meant. Uzair watched my face change. He didn't interrupt. I said, you're choosing comments over me. She said, I'm choosing damage control. I laughed softly and said, by damaging me. She said, please don't make this harder. I asked, harder for who? She said, for both of us. I shook my head. I said, you're the only one protecting yourself. She started crying. She said, you know how people judge. I replied, they're judging me already. She said, I didn't expect this reaction. I said, you didn't expect consequences. She went silent. That silence felt familiar now. Uzair mouthed, unbelievable. I nodded. I said into the phone, when are you posting the truth? She whispered, I don't know. I said, that's not an answer. She replied, I need Horace to fix it first. I laughed. I said, you're still hiding behind him. She said, he apologized. I asked, did he? She said, yes. I said, did it sound real? She paused. I said, exactly. I ended the call. Uzair said, that broke you. I said, it clarified things. He said, same thing. Back at work, Samir finally called me into his office. He said, sit. I sat. He cleared his throat and said, this situation is sensitive. I said, it's fake. He replied, perception matters. I asked, more than truth? He sighed. He said, clients have asked questions. I said, about my personal life? He nodded. I laughed bitterly. I said, so what now? He said, take a few days off. I said, because my girlfriend betrayed me? He said, because noise affects productivity. I stood up. I said, my work hasn't changed. He didn't look at me. That night I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling and replayed her words. I'll look cheap. I said them out loud. They sounded uglier every time. My phone buzzed at 2 a.m. It was Horace. He wrote, sorry again, bro. I replied, stop calling me that. He said, I didn't think it'd blow up. I asked, then why post it? He replied, engagement. I said, you destroyed my name. He wrote, names recover. I stared at that message for a long time. I replied, some don't. He sent, chill. I blocked him. The next day the pictures were still there. The comments were worse. Ariba posted nothing. Not even a hint. Uzair came over that evening. He said, you look hollow. I said, I feel erased. He said, then stop waiting. I asked, for what? He replied, for her to save you. I said, she said she would. Uzair said, she already chose. I checked my phone again. No message from Ariba. I whispered, so this is silence. At work the next day someone laughed behind me. I didn't turn around. I felt tired. Ariba finally called that night. She said, why are you being distant? I laughed. I said, you went missing first. She said, I'm trying to protect us. I asked, from what? She replied, from public shame. I said, by giving me all of it. She said, you're exaggerating. That hurt more than anything else. I said, do you even hear yourself? She said, I'm under pressure. I replied, so am I. She said, then understand me. I said, understand that you chose silence. She whispered, I didn't think you'd take it like this. I said, like what? She replied, like you're leaving. I said, you already left me alone. She cried. I stayed quiet. She said, say something. I replied, I am. After the call I sat in the dark. I realized something painful. Her silence wasn't confusion. It was strategy. Uzair texted, you okay? I replied, no, but I'm awake. That night sleep didn't come. Only thoughts did. I kept asking myself one question. How long will I let this continue? By morning I knew. Her silence hurt more than the lie. And silence, once chosen, changes everything. I decided not to post anything. No explanations. No defenses. No begging for belief. Uzair said, people think silence means guilt. I replied, silence can also mean patience. He asked, are you sure this is patience? I said, it's control. That night, my phone rang past midnight. I almost ignored it. Then I saw the name. Horace. I answered and said, "What do you want?" He laughed and said, "Relax, man." I replied, "You ruined my life." He said, "You're being dramatic." I stayed quiet. He kept talking. That was his mistake. He said, "You know how easy it is to fix pictures now?" I asked, "Is this your apology?" He laughed again. He said, "I'm just saying people believe what they see." I said, "And you enjoy that?" He replied, "It's a skill." Someone else spoke on his end. I heard laughter. Horace said, "Watch this," and described how he layered images, how he matched lighting, how he fooled comments and brands. I didn't interrupt. I recorded everything. After the call, my hands were shaking. Not from fear. From clarity. The next day at work, Sarah stopped by my desk. She said softly, "I heard what's happening." I looked up and said, "Then you know how bad it is." She nodded and said, "Do you want help?" I asked, "Why?" She replied, "Because lies don't deserve to win." That was how it started. Screenshots. Backups. Hidden folders. Sarah said, "This file was altered." I asked, "Can you prove it?" She said, "Yes." I felt something straighten inside me. Ariba called that evening. She cried and said, "Please fix this." I said, "I am fixing it." She asked, "Why won't you talk to me?" I replied, "Because I'm listening." Each call from her sounded weaker. Each message from Horace sounded louder. One night, Sarah said, "He's getting sloppy." I asked, "What do you mean?" She showed me timestamps. I smiled for the first time in days. Ariba texted, "I can't sleep." I typed, "Neither could I." She replied, "Don't punish me." I stared at the screen. I whispered, "I'm not punishing you." Uzair said, "You're changing." I replied, "I'm waking up." When Horace called again, I let him talk. He bragged. He joked. He forgot I was listening. After the call, I said to myself, "Karma doesn't scream. It waits." I woke up to my phone vibrating nonstop. I didn't rush to grab it. I already knew something had changed. Uzair called first. He said, "Did you see it?" I asked, "See what?" He laughed, sharp and shocked. He said, "The truth is everywhere." I sat up and said, "What truth?" He replied, "All of it. Screenshots. Proof. Messages." I asked, "Who posted it?" He said, "No name. Just facts." I opened social media slowly. Not with fear. With curiosity. The post was pinned everywhere. Side-by-side comparisons. Metadata. Timestamps. Horace's own words highlighted in bold. Uzair said, "People are deleting their comments." I said, "People hate being wrong." My phone started ringing again. This time it was Ariba. I let it ring. She called again. I answered on the third try. She screamed, "Why didn't you stop this?" I held the phone away from my ear. I said calmly, "Stop what?" She cried, "Don't play dumb." I replied, "I didn't post anything." She said, "You could have warned me." I asked, "Warned you about the truth?" She shouted, "You knew this would destroy me." I said, "Now you know how I felt." She started sobbing. She said, "My manager called." I replied, "Mine did too." She said, "Brands are pulling out." I said, "People pulled away from me first." She yelled, "You're enjoying this." I said, "I feel nothing." That made her quiet. She whispered, "Horace is not answering." I said, "He's busy." She asked, "With what?" I replied, "Consequences." Uzair texted me, "News channel picked it up." I turned on the TV. Horace's face filled the screen. No smile. No jokes. Just fear. The reporter said, "Digital fraud." I whispered, "You finally look real." Ariba said, "Say something." I replied, "I already did." She said, "You could have stopped the post." I asked, "Why would I?" She said, "Because you loved me." I said, "I loved honesty more." She cried harder. She said, "People are calling me a liar." I said, "They called me worse." I ended the call. At work, Samir walked up to me. He cleared his throat and said, "I owe you an apology." I said, "For what?" He said, "For doubting you." I replied, "You weren't alone." He said, "HR reversed the leave." I said, "I won't need it." He nodded and walked away. My phone buzzed with notifications. Support. Apologies. People rewriting history. Uzair said, "How do you feel?" I thought for a moment. I said, quiet. Ariba messaged again. Please talk to me. I typed, there's nothing left to explain. Her follower count dropped fast. Screenshots spread again. This time with captions that said, truth wins. I watched it all without reacting. No smile. No tears. That night Sarah messaged me. She wrote, it's done. I replied, thank you. She said, you okay? I answered, I'm steady. The news replayed Horace being taken away. His head was down. I didn't feel satisfied. I felt finished. Ariba called one last time. She said, I lost everything. I replied, so did I. Then I found myself. She whispered, I didn't mean for this. I said, intent doesn't erase damage. I hung up. I stood by the window and breathed. For the first time in weeks the air felt light. The truth had gone live. And I didn't need to say a word. I reached the cafe early. I chose a corner table where no one could see us clearly. No cameras. No phones raised. Just two people who used to matter to each other. Ariba arrived 10 minutes late. She looked smaller. Not physically. Emotionally. She sat down and whispered, thank you for coming. I said, say what you need to say. She swallowed and said, I didn't sleep. I replied, neither did I for weeks. She nodded like she deserved that. She said, Horace manipulated everything. I stayed quiet. She continued, he kept telling me it would die down. I asked, and you believed him? She looked down and said, I wanted to. She wiped her eyes and whispered, I was scared to lose fame. I said, you weren't scared to lose me. She flinched. She said, that's not true. I replied, then why was silence so easy? She opened her mouth then closed it. She cried softly and said, I never meant to lose you. I said, intent doesn't change outcomes. She nodded again. She leaned forward and said, I panicked. I asked, do you know what panic did to me? She whispered, I can imagine. I said, you can't. She said, I hate myself for it. I replied, hate won't fix it. There was a long pause. She finally said, I'm sorry. I looked at her and said, that's the first honest thing you've said. She started crying harder. People glanced our way. I didn't look around. She said, please forgive me. I asked, what does forgiveness mean to you? She said, another chance. I shook my head. I said, forgiveness means I stop carrying anger. She looked confused. I continued, it doesn't mean we go back. She asked quietly, why not? I replied, because I loved who I thought you were. She whispered, and now? I said, now I see who you chose to be. She reached for my hand. I pulled it back. She said, I was weak. I replied, weakness explains behavior. It doesn't erase damage. She cried, I lost everything. I said, I lost myself first. She looked up and asked, can we start again? My chest tightened. I said slowly, some lies end stories forever. She shook her head and said, people change. I replied, only when they're forced to. She whispered, I would do it differently. I said, you already did. She asked, do you still love me? I took a breath and answered honestly, I care about who you were. She closed her eyes. That was her breaking point. She said, so this is it. I nodded. She said, you're really walking away. I replied, I already did. Today I'm just closing the door. She cried quietly. I let her. After a while she asked, did you ever doubt yourself? I said, every night. She asked, and now? I replied, now I trust my silence. She laughed weakly and said, you sound different. I said, pain teaches fast. She stood up. I stood too. She said, I hope you're happy. I replied, I hope you learn. She hesitated then said, I'm sorry I didn't choose you. I said, I chose myself. That's enough. She walked away without looking back. I sat down again. My phone buzzed. Uzair texted, how did it go? I replied, it ended. That night I went home alone. I slept without replaying lies. For the first time in months I rested. Closure wasn't loud. It was quiet. And it was mine. I woke up one morning and realized no one was talking about me anymore. Uzair laughed on the phone and said, you're officially boring again. I replied, that's the best news I've heard. My name didn't trend. My phone didn't buzz with opinions. Silence felt different this time. It felt earned. I started a new job 2 months later. On my first day my manager said, Your work speaks for you. I smiled and said, that's all I want. Uzair met me for tea that evening. He said, you look lighter. I replied, I stopped carrying what wasn't mine. He nodded and said, you survived. I said, I learned. Sometimes people still send me the old pictures. They asked, does this hurt? I answered honestly, not anymore. Sarah became part of my routine without forcing her way in. She'd ask, did you eat? I'd reply, yes. She'd say, good. No pressure. No expectations. One evening she said, you don't talk about her. I replied, I don't need to. She smiled and said, that's growth. I saw Ariba once from a distance. She didn't see me. I didn't stop. I didn't feel anything. Uzair asked later, do you hate her? I said, no. He asked, do you forgive her? I replied, I forgave myself first. At night I slept without checking comments. Without replaying words. Without asking why. One night Sarah asked, do you believe in justice now? I thought and said, I believe in boundaries. Sometimes I caught my reflection and said, you made it. No one argued back. I didn't get everything back. I got something better. I lost everything once. Then I found myself. F.